microphone's working, so we're off to a good start. Hello and welcome to this event tonight from Rutherglen and Cambuslang. I'm Angela Haggerty, I'm a journalist and I'm going to be chairing the event. And on the panel I'll just introduce, actually no, before I get to introduce people, we need to do all the housework, we'll get that out of the road. There are fire escapes at the back there and then through that way. And the toilets are back out past the bar if you need to go to the loo, and the bar of course is self-explanatory, that's there, and as you'll see I've already found my way to that one quite quickly. So the purpose of the event tonight is we're going to talk about the case for an independence referendum. So we're not necessarily going to be discussing the case for independence itself, which we've gone over many a time, and we're going to be having those debates for a fair time to come. So what we want to be talking about is the case for a second referendum. What might that look like? What would we be looking at in terms of timing, and tactically what's the best way to approach that for people of the yes side? So on the panel tonight, I'm starting from this side here, we've got Bill Bonnar, and Bill is an executive member of the SSP and he's the party's international secretary. And then we have Kirstein, who is from the Women for Independence National Committee, and she's also the spokesperson in Scotland for the Women's Equality Party, and she's the Professor of Social Policy at Stirling University. And here we have Craig Dallzell, he's the Head of Policy and Research at Commonweal, and something that I think is very cool, he's also a former laser physicist. How amazing is that? I have said to him if he wants to just talk about that tonight, I would be quite happy to hear it. And then at the end here we've got Lindsay Bruce, and Lindsay is the founder of iMail, which is a not-for-profit organisation. What iMail does, if you're not aware of it, is it kind of creates campaign impacts for grassroots groups all across the country, so it kind of gives a central hub, a way for them to easily obtain stuff that they're going to need in their local communities for help with campaigning. So we've got a cracking panel, and tonight's event we're going to try and keep it as a sort of a question time style. So rather than having kind of big speeches and doing it with the traditional format we have for these events, I'd like to really bring it to the floor a lot more and try and get all the questions coming from all you guys and see what it is that you're really curious about. I know I've got a lot of questions about second independence referendum, not least because some politicians have hinted that maybe there doesn't even need to be one. So what does that mean, and what would that be looking like? So we can get into all of that and try and flesh out what it might mean. And I think that we can safely say that the situation we're in at the moment with Brexit, and I don't know if anyone watched that statement from Theresa May last night outside Downing Street. I actually delayed going for a bath so that I could sit and listen to it, and then thought, do you know, I got a great tweet from someone who's sent me a message saying that he delayed emptying the dishwasher to watch that. I thought, well, Theresa May, if you think that that was your getting the public on your side speech, I don't think it's quite worked out the way that you wanted. People were lamenting the dishwasher emptying. So it is an omnishambles, as they say. It's been handled terribly. You know, that's my opinion, but I suspect that many people would agree. And there was a Sky News poll out yesterday that I thought was really interesting, where I think 90% of the people who responded said that they felt the Brexit negotiations had been a national humiliation. So if there's one thing that Britain seems to be united on right now, it seems to be humiliation, and I think that tells you an awful lot for Theresa May. I think it's one of the most incredibly badly handled examples of anything that we've seen recently, and I say that even given the Scotland game earlier today. So without further ado, I'm going to get started, and I've got one question that I'm going to use my privileges as chair and ask the panel before we open it up to the floor. And I think this is going to be a very, very short one, so I want very brief answers from the panel. So the first question, and I'm going to park myself down now that I've done the introductions, and I'm just going to go along the panel and give me a date, not a specific date, but give me a month and a year. When do you think the next referendum for Scottish independence will be? So we'll start, Lindsay, we'll start with you.
I think there's a question about when it should be, which, you know, ideally I would have said towards the end of this year, maybe August, September, but we have to deal with reality, and so I think maybe the autumn of next year, but it might go to 2021.
So that's autumn 2020. You think, okay, right, Craig?
Well, we do have a mandate in the Scottish Parliament to hold one before the end of this Parliament, or to request the Section 30 order to hold one, so that kind of puts an upper limit of spring 2021. If it's not then we're beyond the horizon of the Scottish parliamentary elections, and, well, who knows?
That was a politician's answer.
I'll take a gamble and say, actually, I'd like to see it sooner than autumn 2020. I'd like to see it by the end of this year, because I think there is momentum and this opportunity might not come again.
Okay, given I got applause, I can now tell my answer. I don't have a day, other than I think we should have a referendum as soon as possible, basically. I think a more interesting question is not when the referendum will be, because no doubt at some point Nicola Sturgeon will address the Scottish Parliament at some point and say, we want a referendum, and what a referendum is such and such a day. It will be what happens after that, when the British government, as I've already said, has said we will not have, or we will not grant a referendum. And from the British government's point of view, that makes perfect sense, because no government will call a referendum that they think they're going to lose. And the British government, despite Brexit, are not stupid. They'll look at the opinion polls, they'll look at the likely nature of campaign, they'll look at the shambles, which will be the unionist campaign, much weaker than the last time, and think that's a referendum we are likely to lose, therefore we will not agree any referendum. So the real question then will be what happens the day after, when the British government says no. What did the Scottish government then do about it?
Thanks very much. I think that's one of that's a brilliant question, and it's one that I've been asking for a while, and the answer seems to be that nobody really knows what happens the day after that. We're in a kind of democratic limbo then, aren't we? I'm going to try and open it up straight to the floor. There's quite a lot of people here tonight, and I'll just give a shout out to Independence Live as well. Thanks very much for coming along and streaming the event tonight. You guys are fantastic. And so there might be people watching online that throw a few questions in as well, and we'll take those too. So, hands up, who wants to get stuck in with the first question? Don't be shy. We'll go to this gentleman here and then this lady here.
Hello. Nicola Sturgeon has always said that she will hold a legal referendum. How did she do that? What legal routes are there for Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government to take to get around all the barriers?
Okay, and then we'll take this question as well, and then we'll come to the panel.
Well, as I understand it, Nicola Sturgeon has said she will not hold a consultative referendum without the permission of Westminster. And well, that was recently in the paper, she said that. And in fact, she said something the same at the Women Burundi meeting. So when I asked her, what would be Plan B when Westminster will not ever allow a referendum, particularly if it looks from the opinion polls that they're going to lose it. She was saying we could use this, the next Holyrood election, that people stand on a mandate for negotiation of independence, but we already have 3 mandates Westminster is ignoring. They will ignore that one too. So does anybody have any way around this beyond maybe the Parnell route of starting it up at Westminster, more walkouts and things like that to get their attention? That's my suggestion. But,
Okay, so we're talking about specifically the legal routes. Now there could be routes that aren't quite as legal that we could be looking at, but just for the legal side of things, what can Scotland do to ensure that it gets to use that mandate and hold a second referendum?
Okay. I know what Nicola Sturgeon says about going down legal routes. I think we can get bogged down a bit in legal routes. The decision to hold a referendum or to refuse a referendum is a political decision based on a political calculation, basically. In terms of what we do about it, I think it's in stages. I actually think that the next stage of the campaign, once that happens, will be a campaign for self-determination. It will be a campaign for the right of the Scottish people to hold a referendum. If we have a parliament which has already got that mandate, if we have a campaign which wins over a clear majority of the Scottish people for an independence referendum, then I think it alters the whole political dynamic in Scotland. Because if you think of how that would affect, for example, unionist parties, the Tories, they'll happily stand against it, because that appeals to their core constituency, which is hardline unionists. So you're talking about people, never mind independence, these are people who didn't vote for a Scottish Parliament to start with, and there was a vote tomorrow to abolish the Scottish Parliament, would do so. But think about the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats, for example. In a situation where the Scottish Parliament has called for a referendum, opinion polls show a clear majority of the Scottish people for a referendum, then it throws those parties into crisis. So I actually think the next stage will be that campaign for self-determination, and I actually think that will go a long way to winning quite a lot of, let's call some of the soft no voters who can actually see, even though they're not one for the case for independence, even they can recognise there is a democratic deficit here, and Scotland should have the right to do so.
Kirstein, talking about the legal routes, Scotland does have a mandate through the Scottish Parliament, it has a mandate to ask for a Section 30 order, although Westminster's made it clear that it's going to deny that. So is this something that would go to courts? Would we have to go to court to argue the case for having a second referendum?
I think we have the option of doing that, and I think it's quite likely that that would be a long and drawn-out process. I think we have to be very careful about how we use the word legal as well, because actually we could hold a referendum tomorrow on anything we wanted in Scotland legally. We could hold a referendum on whether the sky is blue or not. And it's a word that is used very much by unionists to say any referendum would be illegal. And that is also not factually correct. And they're kind of banking on the Scottish people being stupid enough to buy that. So that's one of the things I think we need to be really, really careful about. There are lots of routes. We could have a unilateral declaration of independence under international law. Problem is that no other country would then recognise us. And
but would the problem as well not be if we have the referendum, if Westminster says that it's not going to be a legally binding referendum, then you get into the kind of Catalonia territory where you might find that unionists then instruct all their supporters to boycott the referendum and to discredit it and all of those things. Does it need to be legally binding in order for it to be credible?
I think not. And that's because I have the opportunity to, as I did earlier, take a risk on this. Because if we go back to the credible arguments that we know that the Tories will always argue against it, but the other political parties are fighting for their lives in Scotland, and all political parties are fighting for the right to be re-elected and to actually have power to do things. I think there's enough division amongst Labour supporters to actually capitalise on. The other thing about the Catalonia situation is that technically they didn't have the right to hold a referendum, whereas Scotland does. Technically, sending troops in and sending armed forces in was actually a completely legal action on the part of Spain. It would be completely illegal if the UK sent troops into Scotland. So I think we need to be really, really careful about strategy and using the word legality. I think there are actually probably better ways to get to a second referendum than relying on the courts.
There's maybe another way of reframing this argument in that what is the actual purpose of the referendum? Is it there to try and win the argument, or is it there to simply ratify a decision that we've already made as a country? If the opinion polls were sitting at 60, 70, 80% support for independence, the arguments against holding a referendum become rather thin, and you then use the referendum to just simply ratify the decision to become independent. We're not at that stage yet, and we're still trying to fight that case among a great many constituents. If we were out there doing that, even in the absence of fighting over how do we get the referendum, if we're out there winning the case for independence, then we can get to the point where the referendum almost becomes a formality, and I think that's maybe a more productive use of our time.
Lindsay, where'd your stand on it?
I'm going to expand a little bit on the kind of legal side. I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it. So this is what a lot of people don't realise, you guys probably do, but in the UK, Parliament is sovereign, not the people. So it's Parliament that makes decisions, and that is as part of the legal constitution of the UK. Historically, Scotland had a very different take on it, and it was the people who were sovereign, and therefore could override the will of the Parliament. Now, the problem is we don't have a sovereign Parliament, we have a devolved Parliament, which means that it has very limited powers and scope compared to a sovereign Parliament. So the Constitution is technically reserved to Westminster, which on the face of it would seem that we can't actually hold a vote on that, but as Kirstein pointed out, actually we do have the power to hold votes here, and we can hold a referendum on anything we like. The problem is that all votes in the UK are consultative. None of them are legally binding because the UK Parliament is sovereign. So they can actually completely ignore the result. So that's one of the issues that we face with holding a second independence referendum without having the Section 30 powers transferred from Westminster. As far as to a solution to this, I really hope that the solution is political. As Kirstein says, if it goes to the courts, it could be there for years. I also agree with Craig in that I think that becomes a bit of a distraction. And it should really be about what it is the people want. So I don't really have anything to offer as a way forward other than a hope that there will be a political solution and that maybe Nicola has some card up her sleeve. We hope.
Okay, let's go to questions again. We've got Jim over here, and then we've got a gentleman here as well.
Do you think if it was possible to get some nations to indicate that they would recognise a Scottish independent country if the result of the referendum was positive, that that's something that could force the issue?
Yep, and then just gentleman here.
The Brexit referendum is a non-legally binding referendum, and here we are at the will of one group, dragged out of Europe by a Tory party that are not represented in Scotland.
So if we held a referendum and it came back that Scotland wanted to be independent and the UK government was refusing to recognise it, is it realistic that there might be some countries internationally that would recognise Scotland and give us a bit of a route that way?
Well, even before then, one of the things we saw in the last campaign was that the EU stayed very much out of it. There were very, very muted whispers and almost Delphic utterances that were spun out of control to whichever side suited them. The EU does this because it does have quite firm rules against meddling in the internal domestic affairs of its member states. That's why it's been utterly silent in Catalonia. At some point, either in the next few days or next few weeks, months, whenever, the UK no longer will be a member state of the EU and those rules don't apply anymore. So there are whispers in various muted corridors in the EU that maybe there might be some more opinions coming out after that point. I'll wait with hope until it happens, but who knows, we might see a bit more support for Scotland coming to the fore.
Well, maybe we'll go back this way a wee bit. Kirstein, do you think it's realistic? Will we see international support?
I wouldn't pin our hopes on that because an awful lot of countries have successionist movements and Basque territory type territories who are campaigning for independence themselves, and the main nation states are opposed to that. We're actually one of the few countries where we had a referendum that would have been recognised in 2014 had it gone to yes. I would say that in terms of playing the EU card, that would potentially be a much more powerful international diplomatic card to play, because I think there would be quite strong feeling that if we held an independence referendum and then held a referendum on rejoining the EU kind of thing, that would actually repair some of the damage that has been done by the Brexit referendum. And the EU is very much internally looking at how can we make sure nobody else attempts to Brexit, although I think we've done that quite successfully with the other nations anyway. I do think all the, diplomatically, other nation states will be put in a very difficult position by that. While Scotland has an incredibly good relationship with an awful lot of countries and probably better relationships at the moment than the rest of the UK, that wouldn't necessarily last, which is another reason to try and take the opportunity whilst the UK's shot itself in the foot in terms of its international reputation to salvage Scotland's reputation. In terms of whether or not we're being dragged out of the point that we're being dragged out of the EU because of one political party that didn't have that many seats anyway, and a very small fractious element within the Tory party. That's not the case in Scotland. If we were, in quotation marks, dragged towards independence, it wouldn't be because of a fringe, far-right campaign. It would be because people like us have gone out and done the campaigning, and there would be a groundswell of popular support behind it, and the case for civic nationalism as opposed to ethnic nationalism would be incredibly powerful. And that is what would resonate on the international stage. That is what would get us the diplomatic kudos that we need. So it's actually people like us doing the groundwork that will make it possible for the international community to recognise us.
Bill, you're the International Secretary of the SSP, so how do you see the global dynamic?
I think in many ways it's a secondary thing. I mean, it's always good to have international support, and I think actually the credit the Scottish Government is that they've genuinely tried to develop an international dimension to a lot of its activity and give Scotland a voice, and basically argue this thing about the independence movement in Scotland is not a separatist movement. In many ways it's about Scotland opting into the world, whereas at the moment we're a kind of backwater of Northern England. I think once Britain and Scotland is out of the EU, I think the dynamic changes quite a bit. But on the other hand though, we should also look at in terms of behind national governments, there are very powerful national movements across Europe. I was in a conference just 2 or 3 years ago in Barcelona for about a week, and there was people there from obviously Catalonia, the Basque Country, various other. I was there representing the Scottish Socialist Party. There are very powerful movements across Europe that actually are very sympathetic to some of the things that we're trying to do in Scotland, and actually look to Scotland as a bit of a lead. So I think the links we need to be making is not just about affecting this government or that government, but actually making these links below the level of government, because I actually think when we do that, we're actually pushing an open door. On the question of Brexit, there's no doubt about it that Brexit has altered the dynamic of the whole independence debate. And I think it's altered it in this fundamental way, that if you look at the last referendum campaign 4.5 years ago, the choice facing the Scottish people was basically, this is how the Unionists put it in particular, but there was an element of truth in it. You can either have the radical departure, which is independence, or you could vote for the safety and security and stability of the status quo. Now, you didn't have to be a hardline unionist to vote for that option if you weren't one for independence? Why would you not? Why would you not just vote for the status quo, basically? But in actual fact, if you look at what's happened, that status quo no longer exists. And the choice that we face the Scottish people is either you can be part of an independent Scotland or you can be part of Brexit Britain with all the negative ramifications that that involves. And I think that's altered the whole dynamic. And again, and it goes back to the points being made about the democratic deficit. I voted to remain in the last European referendum, not because I'm a great supporter of the EEC. I'm highly critical of it. I voted to remain largely because of the forces that were driving, the kind of reactionary forces that were driving the Leave campaign. But even whether you support the EU or not, there's no doubt about it, there is a democratic deficit there that is beginning to hit home in people. Scotland voted one way and then it's been taken out of Europe by votes in England. And that actually resonates with a lot of people, including a lot of people who voted no in the last referendum.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the floor just now? Okay, right, I'm going to jump in with a question then. We're still on the subject of referendum, and I think that we might come to just shortly the question of, is there a route without a referendum? And there's been a bit more talk about it, and I'm really curious about that. But on the subject of referendums, there doesn't seem to be a massive increase in support, despite everything that we're seeing with Brexit and the shambles that has been. There doesn't seem to be a massive swell for support in favour of a second referendum or indeed for independence itself. So why is that, and what can the grassroots movement be doing to try and make those, to try and change those figures and move it in another direction? Lindsay, I'll start with you.
Regarding why the polls haven't just, because of Brexit, shot up to 60-70%, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that there are actually a percentage of yes voters who wanted to leave the EU. So there's a bit of churn, and it's not that support for independence hasn't increased, it's that some people would actually rather leave the EU than have Scotland be an independent country within the EU. Some of us might find that surprising. I think the other factor is folk are just scunnered with Brexit. It's dragged on for 3 years now. We've still got no idea what's going to happen. It's days away. People just want some stability. I think, even there'll be folk out there who would vote yes, who maybe just don't want to, they'll vote for independence, but they don't want to do it right now. They want a period of stability in their lives before they take that decision.
I get to blow my own trumpet a wee bit here. I've written 2 papers studying the demographics of yes support and looking beneath that relatively stable headline. And as Lindsay says, there has been a fair bit of churn within that. What's quite interesting is we do have that demographic of the folk who saw that infamous tweet by Better Together, the one that said if you vote for independence you'll be out of the EU, and that's what drove them to vote yes. I know people personally who cite that as a reason. But we have since then seen a massive change of opinion for people who saw leaving the EU as a threat to the stability of their livelihoods, namely the EU nationals who live here. That is a very significant demographic that is often ignored, and we should ignore it at our peril. The support for independence among that demographic has went from about 30% to about 65%, because now they've seen that, well, they didn't get a vote in the EU referendum. Talk about the democratic deficit in Scotland being dragged out against its will. We at least were able to express that will. 3 million people in the UK were not able to express that will. And the Scottish Government has said a lot of positive things about this, about folk in this situation. They could be doing more. We've seen promises of guaranteeing the vote for EU nationals and non-EU nationals who live in Scotland. Yet to see that actually become a bit of action. But come the next referendum, we're going to be fighting a very different battle with different allies at our side, and we should start embracing that and start fighting for people who are losing their rights to live here. Went on a bit of a digression there, but I'll pass on.
So, Kirstein, we've established that maybe a couple of things that would be really important if a second referendum was to have credibility and mean something is that two things that could signal that is, one is the polls in favour of independence itself go much higher, up to the 60% region at least, but also that the demand for the referendum reaches that same level. So that would then seem that this is a really critical thing right now that the movement could be working on. So how do they get that number to move?
Okay, well if we look at, I can put my academic hat on briefly and look at the way in which people voted and why they voted the way they voted in 2014 and how the landscape has changed. We know that at the beginning of the campaign we had about 20% who were ardent unionists would have voted to stay in the UK no matter what. We had about 20% who were really pro-independence, which meant we had 60% in the middle who hadn't made up their minds. And we got to, I say we, because at the time I was an academic and I wasn't meant to have an opinion on these kinds of things, I was meant to be very neutral. I got accused by both sides of not being neutral, so I think I probably managed it quite well. But it's that middle ground, it's those people whose minds can be changed that we have to go for. So if we look at how that middle ground voted, they voted in the end for the status quo because they were very risk averse. They were really worried about key things like the NHS, like EU membership, like the economy. They didn't want the disruption, they didn't want the effect it would have on their children and whether their children would have jobs to go to. That's what they were really, really worried about. So given that the landscape has changed dramatically, and we are not looking at a safe status quo versus a dramatic exit, we're looking at two risky scenarios in the future. The job we've got to do to persuade those people is that independence for Scotland is the less risky option. And we can do that by doing a much more broader campaign than we did in the first place. Now, Scotland's Future as a white paper, I know you probably didn't read it, I had to read it, I got paid to read it, was an SNP manifesto. And there was a small but very vocal minority who were like, well, I'm not too averse to independence, but I really don't like the SNP. There were lots of people who said, I really don't like Alex Hammond, or I really don't like Nicola Sturgeon. I will never vote for something that puts them in power. And they lost the argument that it wouldn't be about putting any one political party in power. It was about Scotland deciding for itself which political party would be in power. Now, we are a much broader movement now, and all it would take is for each of us to persuade one person who's undecided to come over to yes. So that's the grassroots campaigning at the moment that we need to do. We need to be having those conversations like we were having in 2014, in the pub, on the train, everywhere you possibly can, with your neighbours, with your friends, and talking about the right to self-determination, the right to have an economically prosperous future for Scottish people that is decided by Scotland. And to line up all the ducks, you know, the NHS would be safer in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. I can give you the stats that prove that. The currency would be safer, whatever currency we chose. And we're getting very, very caught up on whether we have to choose the euro or the pound or whatever. And that is such not an issue right now. The issue is whether or not we get to decide these things. And I don't know about you, but I came over to Yes because I trust the Scottish people more than I trust the rest of the UK. Tell by my accent I'm not Scottish. I was brought up in England. But I do think the parliamentary system and the governance is broken. I would like to see it fixed for the whole of the UK, but that's not going to happen in my lifetime. So I'm going to go for the option that improves things for me and my family, and that's the argument we all need to be making to those around us who are undecided.
So, Bill, what do you think will make those polls move?
Well, okay, why are they not moving? That's probably a key question. You mentioned this term scunnered. I think there's a big section of the population are scunnered with politics. But it's interesting, if you look at the unionist campaign on independence, that's their target, that's what they're arguing. Scottish people don't want this, they don't want this, they're sick to the back teeth of it, basically. But in actual fact, that's why we need a decision on a referendum, because if you have a decision on a referendum, and you have a decision with a date for a referendum, even if it's denied by Westminster, it actually cuts across that argument, because you might be scunnered by politics generally, but there's still a referendum in the horizon, and that actually cuts across it a great deal of that. At the same time, I think the problem we have is we have an independence movement, but we don't have an independence campaign. And we don't have an independence campaign because we don't have a referendum. So we actually need a referendum or a campaign around a referendum to set the campaign in motion. I look at the opinion polls, it's 45, 46, 47%. Those are remarkable figures, absolutely remarkable figures. When you consider the referendum was 4.5 years ago, the SNP, and I'll be critical of them, have done very little in terms of campaigning for independence. Actually, they've done very little for campaigning for independence in their entire history. But in the last 4 years, they've actually done nothing, as has the Scottish Government, against an almost constant unionist campaign. We've seen the collapse in oil prices, although they're beginning to go up again. And we've seen a general disillusionment with politics. And yet you look at the opinion polls are consistently showing independence support is actually higher than 4 years ago. That's a remarkable base to start from. Yeah. And that's without an independence campaign. Think of what will happen when we actually have a campaign and start mobilising people. Because you're right, it's about talking to people and it's about doing all these different things, and we all do that, basically. But there still needs to be a focus to the campaign, and that's the thing that will move the campaign forward. I mean, I'm always a bit baffled by this argument you get from some people in the independence movement, particularly some of the leadership of the SNP. We need to wait and see if the opinion polls change. But how will the opinion polls change without the campaign, basically? If you do nothing, the opinion polls will not change. And also, there's an actual longer term danger here, that if you wait too long, then this moment in history could actually pass. If you wait too long, people will become disillusioned and the issue moves on. We're in a historic moment at this moment in time, basically. Independence is winnable, it's feasible, it's winnable in the here and now. It might not be winnable 10 years from now. And if you just keep sitting back and waiting for things to happen instead of making it happen, then I think there's a danger, a real danger, that historic moment will pass.
I just want to remind you of the figures. 17% to 45. We're starting at 45. This is a much stronger base from which to start, and we don't have to win that much in order to tip the argument. And I absolutely agree that this is a moment, this is what we call in political science, a window of opportunity that will close. And by the time we're all fighting over the last tin of spam and Brexit Britain, people will not have the appetite for that kind of radical change. You need, in order to mobilise people for what would be quite radical change, there needs to be something graspable that will actually improve for them. And if we wait too long, it won't look like an improvement and it won't look like it's actually feasible.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Sheena. I've been an SNP member. I think I first voted when I was 18, I forget, it's a long time ago. One of the things that recently that particularly annoyed me about the SNP is the huge motion, 2 A4 pages about the currency. I mean, I would find it difficult if any country that was introducing a currency could pass the 6 tests that they have put up. That is just to put that into the long grass. Sorry, I'm a bit long-winded, but I'm really, really upset at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks for that comment. Do we have any questions? Okay, we'll take a. Well, don't worry, we'll have back.
Hi. I know you said the start of figures for an independent cafe are sitting around 45% just now. We know that last time we had projects being in the media, still isn't on your side. How do we overcome that?
Okay, so there's a bit of theme emerging there about the campaign approach, and how do you start to build a successful campaign second time around? Now, well, just for the theme of the night, we try and keep it focused on that connection between the referendum and not just the case for independence itself. But obviously the media, the approach to the media and how the grassroots and the campaign broader political parties interact with the media is going to be a big thing the second time around. So how can the grassroots, as a journalist, pick up a lot of hostility obviously from a lot of yes groups towards the media, but as a journalist I understand how important it is to engage with the media and to try and turn that in your favour and to be able to build your own strategies and campaigning tactics to try and make the most of the environment, even if you can consider it to be hostile to you. So is there a way, do you think, and this is particularly relevant for older voters who do rely much more on mainstream outlets as well as a lot of the new media outlets that we've seen emerge, how do people feel about that relationship between yes and media?
I want to talk about this particularly with regards to the over 65s, because again, going back to the way in which they voted in 2014, it was overwhelmingly to remain and it was overwhelmingly risk averse. And this group is incredibly risk averse. And one of the things that incensed me linking it to the media, particularly in the last couple of months of the campaign, was the outright lies that were being fed, deliberately targeted at this group, about things like pensions, the NHS and social care and things like that they care about. Now, one of the things I do in my day job is do research on things that older people care about, like pensions and the NHS, and particularly social care. And all of the stuff that I was coming up with indicated that all of the levers to improve these services would be so much easier to use if Scotland was independent. And that is, and I can produce a fact sheet for you that backs that up, a one-page fact sheet which you can put on your website or whatever. That was the thing, whenever we were doing roadshows, that was the thing that the older people asked about the most. And it's really, really interesting that when we did these roadshows around the 2014 referendum, as I said before, I was there as an independent academic, and people were asking what would happen with pensions. We have the lowest pensions in Europe. We are the poorest pensioners in Europe. We have an ageing population. This problem around health services, around social care services, is going to get worse. And actually, in terms of social policy, this is the kind of problem a civilised nation wants to have, to be perfectly honest. The fact that we've got an ageing population is a good thing. Let's start from that premise, that, you know, older people in Scotland are a fantastic resource and a fantastic group of people. We need to present a vision that is about self-determination, that makes people realise that the things they care about can only get better if they have the levers for change. If that is with the Scottish people, because if we leave it to Westminster and the rest of the UK, it will get worse. There are loads of innovative things, for example, around properly funding social care, treating it as an investment, that we could only do in an independent Scotland. We already see that the NHS performs better in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. That's the kind of thing older people care about. But they need the data, they need the evidence that will actually allay their fears. So that, I would say, is how you need to campaign. And how you need to campaign with the media is to be very, very careful about the evidence that you are presenting to the media. Now, I ran as a parliamentary candidate in the snap general election in 2017 for my pains, and it was the most exhausting things I've ever done. But what I learned there was that I needed to talk and reach out to bits of the media that I wouldn't normally, as a lefty feminist, do. So I had to write columns for the Scotsman, and I had to call up journalists in nationalist newspapers, in very anti-women newspapers, and talk to the tabloids and talk to my local paper ran the most disgusting story about me, but it got me on the front page and it probably won me about 25 votes. So we, as pro-independence people, actually need to be reaching out to the unionist media, and I think if we are presenting them with non-politically tainted evidence as opposed to as a campaign, that's more likely to get picked up by the mainstream media.
I probably don't share that kind of rosy view of the media you have, and just present them with the right facts. The media in Scotland are unionist to the core. They were at the last referendum, they will be at the next referendum. That's a fact of life. The good thing is the influence of the media, particularly the tabloid or the newspapers, is nowhere near what it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. I buy the Herald every day. 20 years ago, the Herald had a circulation of 200,000. It was probably a quarter of that today. It doesn't have the same effect. But I think we've got to recognise that the media don't operate in a vacuum in Scotland. They operate within the realities. Faced with a very powerful independence movement, you do see the media beginning to bend and shift. I mean, I don't need the Daily Record for every reason. It would just be self-evident in such a coup. I don't even know what you call it, a newspaper. But if you look at their coverage during the last referendum campaign, now they're a unionist pro-Labour paper, but they gave it a lot of coverage to independence writers, etc. For the simple reason, a big chunk of their readership are going to vote yes, basically. So the media don't exist in a vacuum. I think they will be swayed by the nature of the campaign. But also, to go back to maybe the wider point about pensions, etc. I think it was you that mentioned, or somebody mentioned, the government white paper the last time, 4 years ago, as being the blueprint for independence. I read it in one day, and I'll tell you now, it's a day I'll never get back in my life. Because in the history of world independence movements, it must have been the single most insipid, unambitious document that's ever been produced by an independence movement. A document whose central message was, don't worry, it's okay to vote for independence, because in reality, nothing much will change. That was the central message. But if nothing much will change, why bother voting for independence? Why just have the union? Now, luckily, the independence movement that developed simply binned that very quickly. It was within a matter of weeks, it was hardly mentioned. And it was overtaken by a much wider independence movement. And it was successful because it did something. It actually presented a different case for independence. For that wider movement, independence wasn't just an end in itself, it was a means to an end. It was a means to making Scotland better. And so it began to link the demand for independence to other demands. So, for example, if you want to get rid of nuclear weapons, vote for independence. If you want to get rid of the monarchy and become a republic, vote for independence. If you want a more equal society, vote for independence. Or if you want Scotland to become a welcoming home for people who want Scotland to be their home, then vote for independence. And so by linking independence to these wider struggles, it galvanised the movement. And it's a principal reason why support for independence went from 22% to 45%. And it's a reason, again, why by doing precisely that, we'll win the next referendum, basically. And not based on, for example, the paper in the currency that's just recently come out.
Okay, so this has been there's been disagreements I've seen plenty of time within the independence movement about, as a campaigning tactic, should it be that vote for independence because everything's going to change, or should it be vote for independence, you won't really notice a difference, you're not taking much of a risk. So from that perspective, when we're talking about getting people on board with a second referendum and how that's been sold, Which side would you be on there, Craig?
I think that for a great number of people, and maybe backed up with the social scientists who study this thing for a living, but people want to hear a story, a vision of what the future is going to be, and they want something to vote for rather than to vote, or more than something to vote against. So something that the independence campaign can do really well is offer a hopeful vision of the future, especially now when we're not fighting, as was mentioned earlier, that this idea of uncertain change versus the status quo. We're now on fighting, Brexit Britain's uncertain change and a spiral into whatever it could be. I mean, we don't even know what the next week is going to hold in store for that, but we can offer a better vision of what an independent Scotland could be.
Do you think it was a mistake then, or do you think it was the right thing to do when the SNPs, since the Brexit vote, Nicola Sturgeon came out the day after the morning that we knew that it had been a Brexit vote, and since then the question of independence and an independence referendum specifically has been very closely tied to EU membership. So do you think that was wise? Because does that mean that Scottish independence, then part of that vision is EU membership? Do you think that was a good tactic, or do you think that that's off-putting for people because it limits what the vision is?
It can be. It's maybe even more limiting in that quite a few of the policies that have come out seem to be working against EU membership as well. Again, to drag things back to the Currency and the Growth Commission, the idea of sterlingising Scotland isn't really compatible with EU membership itself. It also kind of holds the fortunes of Scotland to whatever happens with the UK. And we've got this idea of we will have an update on what the independence campaign will look like once we know what Brexit will look like. Well, what will Brexit look like? And is there a form of Brexit that could mean that Nicola Sturgeon stands up and says, well, actually, this isn't so bad, we can just park independence? I don't think that will happen, but even the vaguest possibility that might be, it kind of puts us in a difficult position as a campaign.
Lindsay, what do you think?
Can I go back to the media question just briefly? Because originally you asked about how do we change people's minds. The one thing that we have that the unionist parties do not is foot soldiers on the ground. They have practically no activists. We have, a good 100,000 plus. How we change minds is through individual conversations.
Yeah.
So, and this is why I do what I do, is the stuff that we produce and we send out in packs to you guys is not so much the stuff through letterboxes, it's for you to start a conversation with somebody and you give them the facts, not the stuff they read in the newspaper, because, I hope Angela will forgive me for this, but journalists, I was one once, a long time ago, journalists are kind of fundamentally lazy, and they tend to write the story that's already been written for them via press release, and especially if you're on a daily newspaper and you have a deadline and you've got to fill so many words in a column. And the lovely guys from the Conservative Central Office have sent you a completely written story with pictures, references, and everything that you need. And all you have to do is maybe rearrange the paragraphs a bit. Yeah, that happens a lot. So how do we counter that narrative is well, you've got to do it based on factual information. And I think one of the things that we do this time around, much, much better, is having stronger answers on pensions, on the currency, on the NHS. Economic stuff was obviously a huge part of the Project Fear last time, and will be again. That will be because that's the only argument they've got left. We're going to be dragged out of the EU. All of the promises that they made in 2014 about jobs, HMRC jobs, shipbuilding, the renewable subsidies, carbon capture, all of those promises have been broken. The only thing they have left is you're too poor. If we can break that argument, we've won. And to do that, you've got to start and you've got to have those conversations on the ground, changing people's minds, seed the doubt that what they're reading in the newspapers is maybe not true. That's how we win.
There's one thing I've often said about that, you know, the view that it was the media that stopped the yes movement from winning the referendum. Not just me, but when you do think about what the polls were at the beginning of the campaign, and even if people did feel like the media was overwhelmingly coming from a kind of unionist starting point, it was incredible then to see how those polls moved. And I think that's testament to the fact that it actually is won on the ground. That's where the most effective changing of people's minds is likely to happen, rather than just based on a couple of things that you've read in the newspaper. So right, anyway, let's move on to questions. So we have a question here, and then we'll come back to
Given the two referendums, 2014 and the EU referendum, which produced very different results, because what was noticeable was this massive turnout that meant there was a yes majority in Glasgow and Dundee. The EU referendum was rather different in as much as the really high votes, yes, Scotland overall, everywhere, voted clearly to remain, but if you look at the breakdown of the statistics, particularly in Edinburgh, which was in the 70s, and some parts of Edinburgh, 90% voted remain. So on the basis of what we achieved last time in more working class parts of Scotland, the potential is for a demographic move more towards the 80s that were much less certain and really frightened that after independence we wouldn't get into the EU. They would see a different possibility this time round.
Okay, thanks. And we'll come back here.
I did my campaigning in the East End of Glasgow, and we weren't, well, in the past when I was campaigning for the SNP, but we didn't usually get, the problem wasn't usually hard questions at the door. It was more often, oh, I've got a pan in the stove, oh no, I don't do politics. A lot of people didn't vote and so on. But in the course of the referendum, that totally changed. We were getting people standing there for 3/4 of an hour, speaking and arguing and asking different questions and also moving. My son canvassed one street in Easterhouse where every single person was going to vote yes. There was no no, and there was no don't know, and there was nobody opening the door and saying, bugger off, I've got a baby in the bath or something like that, which used to happen before. Now, what we need to look at now, these are the people who voted yes massively, people who'd never voted before. We were signing up people in the register who'd never voted. How do you keep the attention of people who are not naturally interested in politics, who don't really want to talk about currency finance or all this sort of thing, but the independence thing caught their imagination, but it's likely that if we drift on and don't have another independence referendum for a long time, these people will go back to realising that voting doesn't get them anywhere, it doesn't change anything. If voting ever changed anything, they would ban it. That whole philosophy, they'll stop being interested in politics and think the only thing you can really do is maybe get worked up about, you know, there should be another crossing at the end of my street, and you go and lobby for that and maybe you can win that, but that's the only thing you can win.
So it's about how do you keep people...
How do you keep people interested and excited? Maybe through, I don't know, I mean, I give out balloons in my stalls. I've got this wee choir, pensioners friendly warblers, who are going around the lunch. and the sheltered workshops singing vaguely political songs. Sorry, away. Yeah, I know the one we had before was.
Well, I mean, I think we've got.
So anyway, how do we keep
So
that
it's about
going?
how do
Maybe
you keep
with
people
music,
engaged
with things that
and-
are not political.
So, but I think that it's kind of
Imagination.
it's connected a little bit
It
to
is
that
connected,
question.
yes.
Because you're talking about there could be a demographic move there because there's Remain voters in areas that weren't maybe big Yes voters in 2014 that may move because they were high Remain voters. But the offshoot of that would be if you start to lose all of the Yes voters that you had in 2014, then do you just end up with much the same result because it's just a change in the demographic. So, and obviously, you know, it's very different things that are going to appeal to these voters that are coming from different perspectives. So how do you again in terms of trying to keep it to the referendum, it's, you know, that finding that route forward. How do you work with those two things? How do you bring in that new demographic but make sure that you don't lose the old demographic? You see what you did there? Very subtle, Craig.
We do have this idea that campaigns, this kind of traditional style of campaigning that involves going around to strangers' doors, knocking on their doors and catching them at their dinner and trying to convince them on the doorstep. I'm not going to say that any particular form of campaigning is completely invalid, but we can learn lessons from other campaigns in recent years. I think particularly of the Bernie Sanders campaign in America, where they actually had a rule for new activists was don't talk to anyone you don't know. So they didn't go out knocking on strangers' doors for a great deal of it. What they did was they said talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your co-workers. Find out what they are talking about rather than overtly going in and pushing our views on them. Engage with them, find out what's catching their attention in the news, saying maybe it is, I'm getting annoyed at the way the pensions are treated. You can engage them in the conversation on that, and then you can start to say, well, actually, in an independent Scotland, this would happen. And you can do this with a lot of topics. And you can normalise the idea of independence through that. And that was a very powerful way of campaigning. That's a very powerful way of breaking through those initial, I don't want to talk about politics barriers.
Okay, Lindsay, we'll come to you and then we'll
Yep.
come back over this side.
Okay. Regarding how to keep people interested, that's a really good question. I think it's about, fundamentally it's got to be about hope. It has to be that, people are going to get into politics because they want to make things better. So keeping particularly young people engaged is going to be really, really important in that. I think independence, there's a unique opportunity for the young to talk about this and what it means for their future. So I think if we have another campaign, I don't think it will be that difficult to engage the young in it, because they were very engaged in 2014. Yeah. I think, as you pointed out, maybe the harder demographic to crack is the pensioners. I'm still waiting to hear a really good idea for how we do that. I'll let you know if I hear one.
Kirstein.
Well, yeah, the pensioners, you just listen to their concerns and demonstrate that their concerns would be better met in an independent Scotland. And it's not hard to do because we've already got the facts to back that up. We know the pensions would be better, we know the NHS would be better, we know social care would be better. I think the idea of listening generally is very, very important in canvassing. Certainly when I've been going out canvassing on feminist issues, I don't go out with, are you concerned about women's equality? I ask, what are you concerned about? And things come up like, well, my teenage daughter walks home and she doesn't feel safe. I get paid less than somebody who's in the same office as me. There are numerous examples where people will bring up the concerns and you can make the case that being engaged in a political movement that would be about self-determination for Scotland would make these things better and more feasible. I absolutely agree we do not need to worry about politicising young people. They will be doing the job for us and far, far better than any of us old people, and I'm including myself in that. Listening to that, I mean, my eldest son was just too young to vote in the last referendum, and I've never seen anybody more angry. And I've never seen a group of people more passionate than his sixth form who were arguing about this, and arguing about it in so much more refined, politically respectful things. And that group of people are now 4 years older, and they are the campaigners of the future. Now, traditional political parties may not be for that. And in actual fact, a lot of them do try and engage with traditional political parties and then get put off this. This is a very different kind of campaign. And people can, I think, once they become engaged, can see why it's important. And those conversations that you have, when you have it with one person and then they go on and have it with another person, they can see the results of that. It's like volunteering, it's like anything. You get the hit back. And it's not hard to mobilise those people. It is, I think we're going back to, we started at the beginning, particularly of the last session, saying people are tired. I think I would go back to Lindsay's point. Maybe they're tired, which is at the point at which they need hope the most. And they need a vision and they need a strategy. They need something to do that is going to get them out of this awful situation that it feels like they're doing. So campaigning for self-determination. It's not about, where we'll be in 10 years' time. It's about who's going to make those decisions. And people, if you think local democracy is dead, try closing a local hospital. Okay? People will come out in their droves with placards, throwing themselves under bulldozers to save it. So you've got to make it local and real to them. And they will come out. A lot of those conversations are carrying on. We're all here because of conversations that started over 4 years ago. We can very easily convince other people to take part in those conversations because we're all charismatic, beautiful, lovely people.
Aren't we? Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to pose you a slightly different question just because we've had a couple of things coming in from online. This is from viewers that are watching on the live stream from Indie Live. There's been a couple of comments. One's from Tommy Hand. He says 2 elections and material change are our key to another referendum. The SNP and the Greens are the only parties who serve the people of Scotland. Unionist parties will never go against the Union. William Ford says, enough talking, talking is over, it's time to take action, it's time to make a decision. And then in that spirit, Ellen Hoffer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks the question, it appears like Scotland is being held in limbo not only by the UK government regarding Brexit, but also by the Scottish government about any news regarding independence. How can the grassroots apply pressure to the Scottish government?
Okay, the last question, I think that's happened already. I think the next SNP conference will be very, very interesting. I think there is a growing impatience in the ranks of the SNP about the lack of action on this issue. And I think you can detect that is forcing a change in position in terms of the leadership of the SNP. So I think that will happen. To go back to a question though about the possibility of maybe shifting the demographic to maybe more affluent people who maybe voted no the last time, I think that would be a profound mistake. Basically, if you look at the breakdown in voting at the last referendum, the most affluent areas in Scotland were the most pro-UK areas. I think East Renfrewshire, for example, I can't remember the vote, 17% or something for independence, whereas support for independence was its highest in much more working class areas. And the reason it was higher in those working class areas, goes back to the point I already made, is that people didn't see independence as a dry constitutional issue. They saw it as a way of changing their lives. And to quote, you quoted an example of Easter House, one of my memories of that campaign, I used to work for what used to be called the Glasgow Regeneration Agency, and it covers an area which is now called Central Cambuslang, but Barrafield, one of the poorest, most deprived areas in Scotland. Voting figures in general election was 12% the previous general election. It was actual voting turnout. Yet on referendum day, people gathered in a demonstration and marched to the polling stations to vote yes, not because of some abstract notion of independence. They certainly thought this is a way of changing things, basically. And I think, the independence campaign will be effective when people see it as a means to change their lives. And that's how we engage people. That's how we engage. You'll not engage them by a dry constitutional argument. You won't change their minds by harking back to 1707, the Act of the Union. It's about the model case for independence, and it's about how it affects people's lives in the here and now. And that's how we'll win them, and that's how we'll win the vote.
Okay. So I'd like to answer that question about how can the grassroots put pressure on the Scottish Government to get moving on the question of an independence referendum. But just so that I know, can people who want to ask questions just put their hand up so I've got an idea of numbers and stuff? Okay, right. Kirsten, if you want to answer that, and then I think I'm just going to come straight back to the floor. Sorry, Craig and Lindsay.
Okay, in terms of how you put pressure on the Scottish Government, well, every political party in the Scottish Government wants to be back in the Scottish Government. So it's up to people to put pressure on their local MSPs and make it very, very clear that it's contingent, them regaining their seats, no matter what political party they are. We go back to the original idea that, Labour and the Lib Dems, etc., are not necessarily going to be opposed to a referendum, certainly if they want their seats back in the Scottish Parliament. So there is that. There is, we know there's a lot of grassroots members who are members of the SNP, and I actually agree that some of the pressure needs to come from within the party. But we also need to make very, very clear, because we, as an independence movement, are not a political party. Okay, we're not bound by when the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish Government or Westminster says we can or can't start campaigning. Once we start campaigning and making noises, then the government will listen, because they'll be thinking about how on earth do I capture these people who are going to possibly vote for me. That's how you start doing it. You start making a noise at the grassroots, because you are all voters, and that's who they're trying to gain the respect of. You have to make their seats look precarious unless they listen to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got questions. We've got one straight up the back. We've got two up the back, and then one in the back row there. We'll take those two.
Hi. I just want to ask the panel, when would you suggest is the correct time to call a UDI or a referendum? Do we wait for a no deal when we drop off the cliff and the next day potentially look at having our parliament closed? Do we wait for that, or do we stick our hand up before it happens and shout no?
Okay, thank you.
Cheers. Can I ask something from the audience? Could people raise their hand if they voted yes in 2014, wait for it, yes in 2014 and then voted leave in 2016? One guy over here, I have another one over there. That's interesting. Just to give people the statistics, according to some statistics, 38% of yes voters in 2014 voted leave in 2016. So there's a really interesting discussion to be had about how they are addressed for the next referendum, because it is true, I didn't believe this for the longest time until I saw the statistics that Craig's talking about. There has been a very massive chunk. Now, I don't believe for 1 second that most people who voted yes in 2014 because they are, for want of a better term, sovereigntists, they wanted democratic decisions made here, then voted leave in 2016 because they want democratic decisions made here. I don't think they're lost to the independence cause. I think that they've been put off by some of the messaging. So I want to ask the question of how are they readdressed? One of the answers I was got from this at the meeting was, well, they can be brought back if they're convinced that immigrants aren't the problem. I'd strongly suggest that we shouldn't make those sorts of, ideas about leave voters. I think it's a complex vote. I mean, for my part, because I've talked to loads of Leave Yes voters, I think there need to be a distinct campaigning group to encourage Leave voters to vote for Yes in the next referendum, but I'd like to hear opinions on that before.
Thanks, David. You're doing very well flying the flag for Yes Leave voters there. At the back row here.
Hi. I've seen currency being good to have own currency, but some people are going to what's have their own currency, and some people want to share pounds, and some people want to have their own currency. But how do you deal with people who want to have their own currency and who want to share pounds? How do you convince them?
Okay. Thank you. Right, I'm going to. I'll come back to the floor just in a sec, so don't worry if you've got questions still, I'll come back to you. And I'm just going to split these questions up rather than going through everyone on the panel so that we make sure we get plenty of time. So, did anyone on this panel vote Leave?
My husband did.
Your husband did. Okay, well, that's close enough. I
know why he did as well.
Okay, well, I'll give you that question first then about how does the Yes movement address Leave voters and make sure that they're not alienating them?
My husband voted Leave, and it took a long time for us to be able to speak to each other at the breakfast table again. And he voted Leave because he thought it was the quickest route to independence. He thought that exactly what has happened would happen, that we would have a dreadfully negotiated Brexit, and that would turn everybody around and say Scotland can manage this better on its own. I would agree with the idea that that particular constituency needs to campaign itself, much as the way English Scots for Yes needs to be talking to the English about it, much as the way the Conservatives for Yes need to be talking to their fellow Conservatives about it. What I would say that ran through an awful lot of when I talked to Leave voters, because it was so shocking to me, because the case for remaining in the EU to me as an academic seemed so self-evident that I didn't really grasp that there were real concerns. And one of the concerns was not so much about immigration, but it was about self-determination. It was about this sense that, much like Westminster is remote, that Brussels was even more remote. And there were rules being made in Brussels that were not in the interest of the country. And they didn't understand necessarily how the rules were made, but they just knew they didn't like it being that distant. So for that, I would say, and this is the one reason why I keep coming back to why independence is a good idea, because it's about self-determination. It's about us as a nation deciding these things. And a nation of under 6 million deciding for everybody is a lot more feasible and a lot more workable than the distant nation of the rest of the UK. It's that argument about self-determination as the route to whatever vision you have for the future, whether that's part of the EU, whether that's we suddenly become a nuclearised nation and be the only small nation with nuclear weapons in the world, I don't know. You have to be really careful about things like, we'll go for independence and then we'll never have the Tories again, because actually we would have the Tories. We would have, hopefully, in opposition, a very strong Conservative Party in an independent Scotland. We would have very strong civic groups in an independent Scotland. So I think the answer to that is, whatever future you see for Scotland, you've got the levers to get there much more effectively if we're an independent nation. You can vote the MSPs out a lot more easily. You can work with civic society in collaboration with the Scottish Government a lot more easily than you can either at Westminster or at Brussels. So that's the argument I would make.
Thanks. Bill, maybe just something we spoke earlier about when we think NDRF 2 will happen. When do you think that it should happen, and possibly even a UDI scenario? Would you be up for that?
I'd got a friend. I suspect that a UDI scenario would. Sorry.
suspect a UDI scenario is not very likely, partly because I think the SNP as a party are constitutionalists to the court, basically. The idea of breaking laws and things like that, I think, runs against the DNA of the party. So in terms of when the next referendum will take place, I think there needs to be a campaign around the right to have a referendum. Actually, I don't see a way past that at this moment in time, basically. I think what happens in the course of that then will inform all the tactics and strategy after that. You would rule nothing out. I certainly wouldn't rule anything out, basically. I think all forms of political struggle are legitimate, given the circumstances, basically. But you need to do that in a way that unites people and brings people together in a way forward, and not in a way that actually divides people. Can I just make another point about the EU, though? In some respects, the issue might resolve itself in terms of the independence campaign. I don't know when the next independence referendum will be, but I think we can take it for granted. Scotland will not be a member of the EU. So the idea of a situation where Scotland has been pulled out of the EU, it will already have happened. The actual question will then be, in an independent Scotland, will Scotland apply to rejoin the EU? That's a different, but that becomes a very, very different argument, basically. And in actual fact, if there was then a further referendum on that issue, I'm not quite clear how that vote would go, basically. A lot of people like myself voted to remain, not because we were great lovers of the EU, in terms of the structures, etc., but simply because of the context of the referendum campaign. So in some respects it might resolve itself. And the argument is a very simple one. Once Scotland becomes independent, it will then have to make a democratic decision whether to rejoin the EU, and that will be a debate amongst the Scottish people to do that.
Craig, I want to come to you quickly on the currency question. Not necessarily as in what kind of currency should Scotland have, but this is a very tricky issue when it comes to even winning the case, getting people round to want a referendum. So tactically, from a campaigning perspective, how do you deal with that without having to necessarily get into the specifics of which currency it's going to be? How can you handle the currency question in a way that's going to be effective enough?
Now, on currency, I'm probably well known as being quite outspoken in favour of an independent Scotland having its own currency, and I come to that point for a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about tonight, from the perspective of self-determination. We need the powers over things like currency and other policies to be able to manage our economy as effectively as possible. But to take Angela's tack on it, for a lot of people who aren't embroiled in the detail of how central banks work and how macroeconomics works, like I often get lost in, a lot of people, when they ask questions like what currency would you use, what they're really asking is, are you sure that Scotland can handle its economy? It's a confidence question more than anything else.
Yeah.
It's the UK is a slightly unusual country in that it hasn't had changes of currency within the last lifetime. We have changed the way we manage a currency, and decimalisation is a really good example of how we go through a horizon when you change sort of how a currency kind of works. I think on average, the average lifespan of a currency right now is about 30 years. A lot of
full
countries,
of the currency geek facts.
yeah. And for a lot of countries, for a lot of people, the currency is something they use, but it's not something they get too hung up about. I remember working in Geneva in Switzerland and kind of marvelling that my restaurant bill could be paid in either Swiss francs or euros. They'd take either, no problem. And the person I was working with kind of remarked, yeah, but Scotland's the weird one. You've got 4 different types of £10 note. So,
I think that's a good, I don't know if any of you watched a lot of John Harris's work around Brexit for The Guardian, where he did those Anywhere But Westminster videos. But one great tip that I picked up from that was that he said instead of going to those communities and saying, what do you think about immigration, or asking the leading question, he would just go up and ask, what's it like to live around here? And that's when he would get beneath the surface of what people really meant when they were talking about immigration and all that. Then they started talking about the local areas and what they didn't like and what wasn't working. So it's like scratching beneath the surface of the question. Are you really asking about the currency, or are you asking about something else?
Or are you asking more about maybe an issue like why is the bank closed down and I now have a 30-mile trip to get my money out?
Okay, I want to try and, I know I'm very aware of time, so I want to try and get round, Lindsay, I will come to you, but if we can take in some more questions.
We've talked about putting pressure on politicians. Do you think pressure should be, or how can pressure be put on journalists to be more objective?
Lindsay.
I'm already in the doghouse. You know, I think it's really interesting that the person who actually wrote the vow for the Daily Record, Murray Fu, is now going to vote yes. So I don't know if it's so much pressure as, you know, maybe drawing their attention to some more of the facts that they maybe haven't seen. You know, when they get that press release from the Tories or Labour, or when they're, you know, having a cosy lunch over a pint with some of their political chums, and one of the things I've seen happen on social media, which I hate, and I've caught myself doing it, is when you end up barracking, piling on a journalist because they've written something that you disagree with, and that's something that I'm trying really hard to resist. And you know, it even happened yesterday with Channel 4 News when they did their fact check and said Scotland would have to join the Euro. That's blatantly false. But people did engage with that and actually linked to the EU's website and pointed to the paragraph that says, actually this will happen in its own time and it is up to the country to do this. There is no path, there's no timescale for actually transitioning. And lots of people pointed to that. So rather than hurling insults, it was actually, we think you'll find if you go and read this, you'll see that it's not. That kind of engagement is really positive, that's good. It's when you get the kind of you're just a unionist shill kind of stuff, that's not so good. Having said that, we also had a case this week where Kay Burley was somewhat less than, I think, less than objective. But again, there's no point in barracking these people. I think it's just positive reinforcement of the information that we want to report.
It's worth saying as well that newspapers are, when they take their positions on things, they are often thinking about readership that they already have and not wanting to upset and alienate them. So if they take a yes position when they suspect, then they will be taking data from their demographics. If they think they have a no voting demographic, if they go all out yes, they're probably going to lose readers. So actually just changing the minds of the public, I think, has a knock-on effect on newspapers, and we've already seen with the likes of the Daily Record and the Herald, I think, that in the aftermath of the Brexit result, they already hinted that they might switch, that they would be definitely open now to switching editorially over to yes. So I would agree. I think if you go on the attack to journalists, it will make them put their walls up.
Yeah.
If you be positive and you try and win them round, you're much more likely to get a good engagement there.
What I'd say is, if you aren't writing your story, you're letting somebody else do it for you. So write into your newspapers, talk to your local journalists, talk to the journalists, give them the stories, let them know what's happening in your area and what you would like to see them write and talk about. And that's how you can affect change.
We'll come here. That one.
I'll do this briefly. Going back to the idea of influencing people and influencing potential people who will know into yes. I mean, honestly, all of the conversations that I had around 2014 when I was an independent, academic who wasn't meant to be persuading anybody, I was meant to be presenting them with the facts. When we took a poll at the beginning of these meetings, around 70% were undecided. At the end of the meetings, when they'd heard the facts, all of the undecideds had gone to yes. Some of the no's had gone to undecided. Nobody went no. The facts and really good, strong arguments speak for themselves. And going back to this, how you influence your friends, yes, absolutely. You influence them by talking and persuading, and actually that's how you influence the media. Give them something to cover. In my experience, all of the mainstream media, including the news, the TV, are desperate for images. They're desperate for content. Give them positive content. Get out there with your banners. Put things across, rude statues in Glasgow, God knows what else. Give them something to talk about where they have to engage with the messages that you are doing. And the other thing is that what is quite different, I think, this time round, is that we're all a lot more social media savvy. And actually a lot of what is so-called the news is actually people's blogs and things like that. And that's actually much more powerful than it was in 2014. And even though I'm really shit at social media, I use it to persuade people. So get people going to alternative news sites, going to alternative blogs, where you're making the arguments in a reasonable, rational way, because the unionists, as we say, haven't got the foot soldiers, so they're not going to be out putting big banners on Glasgow statues. They're not going to have the coverage of that. And they also don't really have much of a substantive argument apart from the fear argument. And we can counteract that with the hope and the facts.
Thanks, Bill. If you could be briefish.
Okay, how do we deal with media is actually a wider question about how do we deal with no voters, basically. The 55% who voted no the last time. We've got to be careful though that we recognise there's a constituency out there which are solidly pro-union. They believe themselves to be British. They're British in a matter of principle and will never support independence. I've got complete respect for them because their position is based on clear principle. But there's also just as many no voters who aren't that wedded to the union, they just want independence, basically. So that's the group that we have to engage. And we do it, you're quite right, the lady there and said about talking to friends, etc. I think we've all had experience of that, where you talk to people, you gradually engage with them, you work out where they're coming from in terms of their ideas, you try to answer that. But also don't let us ever forget that that itself, while it's important, is not a substitution for actual going out and campaigning in terms of chatting doors and petitions and all the other stuff, which draws people into the notion that there's a movement out there, a big movement for change, and I want to be part of that movement. And that had a big impact the last time, I think it'll have a big impact this time.
Okay, thank you. Well, listen folks, I'm a very aware of the time. We need to wrap up now. We should have wrapped up at 9:30, so we're a wee bit late. And just before we do, could we say a very, very big thank you to all the staff here tonight that looked after us. And we also say thank you to Indie Live, who are brilliant. And then finally, before you wear your hands out, could we say another very big thank you to all the panel tonight. Thanks very much everyone, good night and happy campaigning.